Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning for the Together for LA webinar series. We have a wonderful program scheduled for you today on Surviving the Big One, a small business guide, hosted by LA EDC and the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society. I am Angela Amirkanian, Program Manager for LA EDC's Together for LA program, as well as your moderator this morning. I would like to share a little bit of information about LA EDC and our mission. LA EDC is a nonprofit public benefit organization whose mission is to harness the power of private sector in collaboration with Los Angeles County to guide economic development and create more widely shared prosperity. This webinar series and presentation is brought to you by Together for LA. Together for LA is a strategic partnership whose mission is to strengthen and support women and diverse-owned small businesses across Los Angeles County as we strive to recover from the economic crisis wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic. No-cost technical assistance and connections to small business resources, as well as this webinar series, was made available through a generous grant from Wells Fargo's Open for Business Fund. Together for LA is a strategic partnership powered by LA EDC, however, enhanced by our partners. Our partners are the LA Area Chamber of Commerce, LISC LA, ISD, our co-presenter today, the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, City of Los Angeles, as well as County of Los Angeles. I'd like to introduce you to our website. This is our designated small business resource hub. Please take a look at laedc.org/coronavirus after the webinar, where you will find an incredible list of businesses and resources that are specifically available for small businesses. We update this website on a daily basis, and as you know, new resources, programs, grants, and loans are continuously being announced. So as soon as we hear of a resource, we put it up on our website for you to take advantage of. What's really great about the website is that we have an easy to use filter system where you can search based on your industry, your business type, and the type of resource that you're looking for. For example, if you're looking for grants and loans, you can simply filter the resources based on that. So please take a look at our website. And once again, that's laedc.org/coronavirus. LAEDC has an incredible no-cost technical assistance program that I would also like to share with you. We offer business consultations that are complimentary and confidential, available to businesses of all sizes and industries. So if you are interested in further connecting with our multilingual business assistance team of experts, we would be happy to connect with you after the webinar. Some areas that we can assist you with are workforce training and development, tax incentives, cost containment strategies, marketing, creating a business plan, financial resources, and so on. So we'll be happy to connect with you after the webinar, and I will share how to do so. We are your connection to resources, like I mentioned, depending on your area of need. For example, workforce or financing, we will make personal email introductions to a live person that can actually assist you and further address your need. Now, for what we've all gathered for this morning, today's presentation topic presented by our wonderful guest speaker, Dr. Lucy Jones from the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, has joined us this morning to talk about surviving the big one and share a small business guide for us this morning. I would like to introduce John Bwarie. He is the Deputy Director and co-founder of the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society. And I would like to quickly introduce John before we get into the program. John is Deputy Director and co-founder of the Dr. Jones Center for Science and Society, who has spent over a decade engaging with communities, crafting messages, and delivering results in support of resilience and the use of expert information and decision-making. John has worked alongside Dr. Jones since 2007 and was instrumental in creating the Great Shakeout. Please welcome John Bwarie.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome everyone. We're quite excited to be here today for this program. I do have the honor and privilege to work alongside Dr. Jones in the work that we do at the center, and we are so honored to be a part of this collaborative with LAEDC and the other partners to provide Together for LA in support of our small businesses across LA County. But enough about what we're doing. I think you're here to hear from the expert herself, Dr. Lucy Jones. She has spent more than 3 decades in public service as a federal employee at the U.S. Geological Survey before retiring just about 5 years ago, when she started and founded the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society with the mission to provide scientific and expert information to decision makers and others in order to create a more resilient world and more resilient communities. And that extends today in the work that we do with small businesses. And we've been partnering with LAEDC and the LA Chamber, LISC, the Institute for Sustainable Development, LA City and LA County over the last year in order to make sure that we are working most effectively in support of small businesses and their resilience, both in response to the most recent disaster and in anticipation for what we all face next. So without further ado, it's my honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Lucy Jones.
Thank you, John. And I will, I'm going to talk to you today about an earthquake. I know we've all been dealing with the pandemic, but we also know that at some future time, the earthquake is going to be part of what we're facing in our future. And we're going to look today at how to be ready for it and also how to be able to use what you've learned through the pandemic to be better able to handle what's coming in our future. You know, when we think about earthquakes, we here in Los Angeles, we often think about Northridge. I think we all remember the Northridge Meadows apartment complex and the collapse, and 17 people died in the collapse of that building. And that strikes at the fears that all of us have about earthquakes. We're very afraid of dying in the event. We don't sometimes spend as much time thinking about some of the other consequences of the earthquake. I mean, this, to people who study disasters, is the real impact of the earthquake, the number of businesses that were lost, the amount of money that was destroyed. You know, the 35 people who died in the earthquake is equal to about, less than like a week on California freeways in terms of the death toll. But the economic impact was really severe, with about $40 billion in losses. So what I want to do today is talk with you about the earthquakes, help you understand why we have our earthquakes that we do, understand what they will be doing to us and what you should be expecting from them, but also the ways in which you can reduce your risk from earthquakes so that you can be the people who will get out there and take the steps to build resilience in our community, because resilience is going to be happening together. Let's start with what might seem a really basic and simple idea, but I want to talk about what an earthquake is. To a seismologist, the earthquake is the sudden slip of one block of rock past another that produces shaking as one of its effects. That's a little different than everybody else who thinks of the shaking as the earthquakes, but the fundamental cause is the movement of the fault. I'm showing here a picture from the Kobe earthquake, where you can see how this rice paddy was offset. It's a distance of about 6 feet during the earthquake. And it's that sudden slip that produces the shaking. Just like when you snap your fingers, the sudden slip of your one finger past the other produces shaking that causes the sound that travels to your ears. The fault produces the shaking that travels out through the earth. And it can travel quite a distance, but it dies off with distance. So the closer you are to the fault, the worse the shaking is. And that fault is not just a point. Notice I didn't say closer to the epicenter. An earthquake happens over a surface. The epicenter is just where it begins to move. And that surface can go for a long ways. Here's a picture from another earthquake in New Zealand. This fault was extended a distance of over 200 miles to produce a magnitude 7.9. So here's another really important point. The longer the fault, the bigger the earthquake. And when we have our big earthquake, when the San Andreas finally moves, we think that'll be the big earthquake because it's the longest fault. And that means Strong shaking, yes, but strong shaking for more people, because every point on that fault is given off shaking. And that means that the shaking you receive depends on your distance to the fault, not your distance to the epicenter. There's two really important points that I've been talking about here of magnitude. That's the total energy released by the earthquake, and it's controlled by the length of the fault. But it does not control what happens to you. That's determined by what we call shaking intensity. So an earthquake has one magnitude and many intensities depending on where you are. And to be able to show you some videos, we've put together a little piece. I'm going to show a video of myself talking, which is a little funny, but we do this here and you'll be able to see what's the difference and what the shaking is like.
Magnitude is one number representing the total energy released in the earthquake. It was developed here at Caltech by Bino Gutenberg and Charles Richter, and they were trying to express the idea that there is an innate size to the earthquake that is not what you feel. Because there would be an earthquake, like in Inglewood, and people in Inglewood felt it very differently from the people here in Pasadena, and they would talk about it as though it were two separate earthquakes. So they were trying to get through that idea that there's an innate size that is not what you feel. We have been talking about magnitude for so long, there's a lot of people who think magnitude's what you feel, right? And actually that is expressed with something called intensity. So we use the modified Mercalli intensity scale here in the United States. It was the original Mercalli scale, was developed in the 19th century. It preceded the idea of magnitude. And it is a subjective description, originally, describing the impact and what you feel. Intensity 1 means nobody felt it. Intensity 3 is the type of thing that if you're sitting still, you really notice it, but maybe if you're walking around, you miss it, the fact that it's happening. By the time you get up to intensity 5, that's a level at which you'll see, everybody notices it. You start having people being frightened and really wondering what's going to be happening. Lots of noise as things get shaken around, but unlikely that anything's actually thrown off of a shelf. That's intensity 6 is sort of the definition of that level at which you're starting to really see things thrown off of shelves. A California building is probably fine at that level. An old masonry building without any retrofitting or any reinforcement, those start coming down at intensity 6. By intensity 7, you're seeing older buildings faring poorly. Even like the wood frame stucco construction, if they weren't bolted to their foundation, they can be shifted off at that level, or the cripple wall around the crawl space can be broken down. By the time you get to intensity 9, that's where we're seeing big buildings coming down, and you see the collapse of concrete structures. We've seen collapse of freeway bridges at that level. Intensity 10 is actually the largest one we use now and might be involved with derailing trains and things being thrown into the air, accelerations literally exceeding the force of gravity. We've seen earthquakes where after the event, we have upside down grand pianos or upside down VW buses. So things do get literally thrown in the air. We can have accelerations exceeding the force of gravity when we get to our biggest ones. But that's only for our biggest earthquakes and when you are very nearby.
So we have this idea of intensity, and I'm making a point of this because I think it helps really understand what it is that you can do to make yourself safer. Since the earthquake has one magnitude, in the case of the Northridge earthquake, that was magnitude 6.7, right? But it has a map of intensities. So if you went through the Northridge earthquake and you think, I know how to handle a big earthquake, that's true if you're up there in the northwest part of the San Fernando Valley. I mean, if you're there where the really strong shaking happened, yes, you've got some of the strongest shaking that we're going to have. But if you were elsewhere in Los Angeles, if you're down south of the Santa Monica Mountains, if you were over in Pasadena or up in the Antelope Valley, you did not get strong shaking. And there will be a future earthquake with much stronger shaking for you. And that is where the damage happens. If we now go and look at what happened with Northridge and those iconic pictures that we remember of the badly damaged buildings. Those all came from that area where it shows red, either intensity 9 or 10. That's really where the damage is. Many of us feel it, but few of us get the strongest shaking. Now, of course, the longer the fault, the more places are near it and the more places that will be getting that strongest shaking. If we think about what's in our future in Los Angeles, it's tempting to say, let's take one earthquake and look at what it's like. And in fact, the origin of the shakeout was taking the San Andreas earthquake and saying exactly what will that be like. But the reality is, we don't know which earthquakes are going to be happening in our immediate lifetime. We think of, we talk about the San Andreas because it's the most rapid. It has a big earthquake every 100, 150 years or so. But sometimes it takes longer. It's actually been over 300 years since the biggest earthquake on the southernmost part of it. And if it's been able to go 300 years, why not 350 or 400? So we don't know what's next in human time scale. And it's not because we didn't try. I do want to take a moment and just say, I often hear people think that, why can't you predict earthquakes? Or there will be rumors that go around on the internet with various, somebody's predicting earthquakes. You can't. And it's not, again, because we didn't try. I entered this field thinking that that's what I was going to accomplish in my life, is learn how to predict earthquakes. We saw foreshocks before some big earthquakes. So I said, let's study those foreshocks. All we have to do is see what's different about the foreshocks, and then we'll have prediction. The reality is there's nothing different about the foreshocks. We only know there are foreshock after the biggest one happens, and then we go and change the name and call the first one the foreshock. So no scientifically verifiable method has ever come up. When you see a prediction going around, know that it's not coming from the scientists. And again, not because we don't want to do it, but because we can't. Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And many of the professionals have stopped trying to predict earthquakes because we found that it really is random. But that doesn't mean it's because we're ignoring it. What we can do is say, what does the geology tell us? And that's what we do with maps like this, which show you relative hazard. Where are the places with the most active faults? And you can see that white band going down through the state. That's where the San Andreas is. If you're right by the San Andreas, you have a higher chance of having strong shaking. But because, say, you're in Orange County and you have a somewhat lower rate than Ventura County, which has a higher rate, does that mean you should be doing less? Well, no, because we don't know which ones are going to be happening in our lifetime. And we all have to be ready. And of course, we need to remember, too, that even when the earthquake maybe happens somewhere else, we can be feeling the impacts. When the San Andreas earthquake happens, we might be losing water deliveries. Every bit of imported water in Southern California has to cross the San Andreas Fault to get here. So we all have the potential for being impacted by the events, even if we're not exactly where the shaking is. We all need to take it seriously. If you come in and look at Los Angeles County in detail, yes, there's some places with a little higher values than others, but let's be honest, we all have the highest rate anywhere in the country. So what do we do about it? And we need to develop resilience. So I like to talk about the resilience equation. What is it that's going to cause us problems, and what can we do to change it? Right? We start with the hazard, and that means what the earth is doing to us. That's the faults that we have. That's that map that we just looked at, right? The earth is going to do what the earth is going to do. We aren't changing that. Then let's look at the exposure. Where have we put people at risk from this environment? Right? And so how close are we to all of those faults? What's the shaking we're going to be receiving? But it's not just whether or not we're there, it's also how we build it. So the fragility of what we have built. If we make weaker buildings, we are going to be in more trouble. And of course, with time, we've learned how to build stronger buildings, but many of our old buildings are still there and present a very serious weakness to us. Now, those all Those are all the multipliers. Those are the ways we increase our risk, right? But we can now decrease our risk, increase our resilience by how we respond. And the way in which we respond right away can make a huge difference in what the final outcome is. And beyond just how we respond, there's how we recover. Because the earthquake may be over in a minute, but the impacts will be going on for years or decades. And how we respond there and how we come together as a community is a big part of how we'll get through this. So let's go look at each of these pieces. I said hazard is what the earth does. There's no way we're stopping that. We got to accept this. Exposure is how many people we've put on top of the faults. And you might say, hey, let's not go build on the faults, but sorry, it's too late now. We've already built on top of the faults. There's almost 100 active faults just in Los Angeles County alone. So we really can't do this by avoiding it. Those two are pretty well settled, but now we're going to start looking at the things we can change. And our structural weaknesses, how well we've built our environment, is some place where we can make a difference. Right? Let's start by thinking about older buildings. Right? There are several types of buildings in Southern California that we know are problematic. The worst ones are brick buildings, what we call unreinforced masonry. And every jurisdiction in Los Angeles County has required retrofitting of these buildings, mostly several decades ago. There are very few unretrofitted URMs, unreinforced masonry buildings, left in Los Angeles County. The other types of problems are still often around. Soft first story is the problems like the Northridge Meadows apartment. In Southern California, most of these buildings are residential, but it's where you have a first floor with big openings, usually garage doors or carports. If there are some like residence over retail sort of structures where you have big plate glass windows on the first floor that can also provide the same sort of empty weakness as the carports do. Many communities have been moving towards requiring retrofit of these. Los Angeles is almost completed. So the city of Los Angeles has almost completed the retrofit of these buildings. Many others are coming through now, but not all. Non-ductile concrete buildings are one of our biggest commercial issues. It's the sort of commercial buildings that were built in the 50s and 60s. It's much of Los Angeles County. There's some known vulnerabilities. You have to get a structural engineer in to look at it. Los Angeles City is requiring retrofit of these buildings, but in most other communities, they're still there. And they are one of our deadliest buildings because concrete is very heavy. Then there's also the problem with steel frame buildings. We haven't really, we recognized the problem in '94 that there are welds of those buildings. And this is a harder one to deal with, but it really only applies to our big buildings like in downtown Los Angeles. So these older buildings have the potential for actually being deadly, but there are a lot of buildings that have the potential of not being usable. Even in our newest buildings, our building code does not require that the building be usable. In fact, a modification to the building code that said, let's make a requirement that they be at least repairable, which would have added about 1% to the cost of construction, just failed in the assembly once again. So what we have is a building code that says the building shouldn't kill you. The only role of government is making sure you don't kill somebody with your building. But if it's a total financial loss, that's your choice to make. And we can see the consequences of that choice in Christchurch, New Zealand. They had an earthquake in 2011 to a city that is built much like Los Angeles. The building code is the same. It's called the International Building Code. The building styles are very, very similar. And this is what the city looked like in 2010. About 450,000 residents. An earthquake happened literally under the city. Remember I said the strongest shaking is when you're right on top of the fault? Well, you can see from that line of dust, that fault ran down through the city. And when that happened, these buildings received what's called a design shaking. This is what they've been designed to withstand. That's that 10% chance of not collapsing. In fact, none of these buildings collapsed in the face of their design shaking. There were some building collapses in Christchurch, but 2 buildings, but they were both older buildings that were built to earlier standards, the non-ductile concrete problem. None of the modern buildings collapsed. Nobody died in a modern building. And the engineer said, see, we did our job. Well, what that job was included 1,800 buildings that had to be torn down. And 4 years later, this is what their downtown looked like. The buildings didn't kill people, they didn't collapse, but they were so badly damaged, they had to be rebuilt. And the Central Business District of Christchurch was closed for over 5 years, right? And this is likely to be the consequence of what we're having here. So what can we do about it? We don't have to accept this. We can come up with buildings that do better. In Japan, you know, they had a magnitude 9 in 2011, and directly onshore from the epicenter was the city of Sendai. It received the highest levels of shaking by the Japanese scale, which is slightly different from ours. And this is what it looked like afterwards. No buildings, no significant engineered buildings were badly damaged. So we could choose to be building to a higher standard. I want to make the point, mitigation really does work. We know how to build to not withstand it. Now, what does this mean for you? How do you change your personal risk equation? The most important thing I would say is understand your building. If your business depends upon a building being there, if you own it, you can get it retrofitted and make it stronger so it'll be fine in the earthquake. We really do know how to do that. If you don't own it, you need to have a plan for how you're going to operate without it. How is that going to affect you? And if you know, it's a really modern building, it's not that tall, you know, you're probably in fine shape, but you need to get a structural engineer to tell you. And this is one of the resources that we can provide, is help you connect you with structural engineers just to help you understand what is your risk, because you can't plan properly if you don't understand it. All right. So, but it's not just your building when we think about fragility. We can also talk about fragile interiors. Right? The non-structural damage that happens through shelving that comes down, through toppled bookcases and filing cabinets, and all of these can be, of course, they injure people. In the Northridge earthquake, of the 35 deaths, there were 2 that were directly in buildings that were perfectly fine, and they were caused by collapsing books and filing cabinets onto people, so they can be deadly. It also costs a huge amount of money. About $12 billion of the $40 billion in losses in the Northridge earthquake came from non-structural damage. And this is someplace where it is much easier for you to make a difference, in part because the government hasn't been involved in this. We don't want government coming in and telling us how to set up our individual offices, but that means it's up to you to make sure they're safe. And it's pretty easy to do. So as we look at changing this equation, the second step is really conduct a hazard hunt in your facility and secure your space. Look at what could fall down and think about what you can do to secure it. This is incredibly cheap to do. I have done it with every school that my children attended, and we would turn it into parent work days. We're not talking about difficult things, but it both makes your employees and customers much safer, but also then reduces a very large amount of loss. Okay, another place of fragility where you're going to have less control is the fragile lifelines, our community structures. And when we look at what happens in earthquakes, damage to pipes, and therefore both waters and sewers, is a very big issue. Damage to electrical systems and damage to transportation. And of course, in a modern era, electricity is also really synonymous with communication. So we have some great difficulties in doing communication after an earthquake as well. These ones, you can make a difference by supporting your leaders or your community leaders who will take this on and think about doing it. Water districts are often very local. If your community is really demanding water, you can make a difference with that. Transportation's harder. That's mostly run out of the state. So one of the most important things you can be doing here is looking at the ways in which you can manage while these things happen. And that means that we're now getting into response, right? So when the earthquake has damage, when our fragility that you weren't in control of has affected the impact of the ability of your community to function, what do you do about that? And then we come in here and we plan. This is something that if you can do a better job of responding, if you've talked with your employees and have a plan, how are they going to get to work? How will you know if they're okay? What do you want to help them with? Either when they're at home when it happens, or what happens if they're at work? And do they have children in daycare that they're going to be desperate to get to, right? Coming up with a plan together about how you're going to respond means that when you respond, you're going to be much more effective and you're going to be able to get your business back up more quickly. Now, this might all seem pretty daunting. We're saying, making all these plans, conducting the hazard hunt. There are resources available. There's a lot of them. I will particularly recommend a publication called 7 Steps to a Disaster Resilient Workspace. John, perhaps you could share the links for this. If you just search for 7 Steps to a Disaster Resilient Workspace, you'll find it online. Put together really between the scientists who understand this, the engineers who know what the damage is, but also then all of the business interests that can help us, who understand what it is that a business needs to do. And when when you look in the detail, there are these 7 steps. This document has a lot of great help on how to handle each of the individual ones, how to think about it, and discussions with various business owners who have already gone through this. So if you go and take this on, you will make a difference when it comes time to be responding to the earthquake. Notice that the last step, it says reconnect and restore. And that's where we're getting into what we call the will to recover, right? And this is because when we look at what happens in disasters, we find that it's the ongoing consequences and disruption to economy that can dominate what our total losses are. When we think about what happens to our economy in a disaster, we sometimes look at this basic type of graph where we're plotting on the vertical scale wealth and economic activity, ways in which money are made or assets are accumulated versus time. And we expect our economic activity to grow with time, right? That's otherwise we're going into a recession. So we expect it to keep on going, but when the disaster hits, we drop down and we lose a lot, both things that are destroyed, but also economic activity that's disrupted, that without electricity or people can't get to your business, you're not going to be there making any money. And what we're trying to do in the recovery is come back to that expected level as quickly as we can. That when the event happens, if people have insurance, to bring in contractors to help them rebuild, and the contractors hire subcontractor, and we get the economic engine going again. We really did this very well with Northridge. Of course, it wasn't as widespread a disaster. It was really concentrated in the Northwest Valley, and the rest of the city could really mobilize the resources to help. And 40% of homeowners at the time had earthquake insurance. Now, if we don't get it going quickly, we sometimes see something like this, where we start to recover, but people just can't get it going and the business ends up failing. People give up and move out of the region. This happened in New Orleans. People, plenty of money was thrown at the problem, but people just weren't willing to come back. And the economic activity of the city of New Orleans was significantly depressed. It's still below the level it was before Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005. And when you compare these two curves and the sort of area under the curves, you can see that the money to be lost when we don't recover quickly can dominate and be much more significant than what happens in the disaster itself. So the biggest question when we get ready to prepare is, how do we speed up recovery? How do we make sure we can get back and get going again? Start with mitigation. If your building wasn't damaged in the first place, you don't have to repair it. And of course, and all of that structural damage happening to your all of your inventory, et cetera. To the degree to which you can prevent the damage, you don't have to recover from it. The other thing that's really important is that planning, because if with planning, we improve our response, we quicken the recovery, we have less to recover from if we've responded really well. And that can make a huge amount of difference as we get forward. And of course, the quick influx of money, the ability to have insurance or other type of financial resources to come in and help. But just like we saw in New Orleans, we've got to remember that we've got to be helping the people. Because when you look at what happens to people in an earthquake, it's scary, it's traumatizing. It makes you want to run away. And if we're going to be keeping people with us and keep our employees and keep our customers, we need to have a reason to stay here, and it's got to not feel overwhelming. So as you plan for recovery, think about your employees, do it with them. How are you going to be able to make it so people want to be here? And you actually know a lot of this already. What you've just gone through in the pandemic is very similar to what we're talking about after an earthquake. You couldn't use your space. You couldn't go into your building. How do you keep your business recovering? And when we look at the damages from an earthquake, we lose electricity. How can we damage a building, we can't be there. If we still have internet, we've just learned we can work remotely, right? We don't have water, but if we still have transportation, we can cart some water in and plan for it that way. So thinking about it ahead of time, planning, using your experience from the last year, you can make a plan with your employees that'll make sure that you're the ones that are coming back quickly. This is, of course, the week of the Great Shakeout. On Thursday, we will have people across the country participating in an earthquake drill. Right? But Shakeout should be and can be more than just one practice at getting under your table. This is a time that you can start your plan. It's a good time to be talking with your employees because they're hearing it from their kids' school. It's a time to be able to focus your ideas, start the planning. We often say with the Great Shakeout, just take one more step, do the drill and do one other thing. Start your planning so that you can be ready and be the one that's recovering, because what we're trying to accomplish is a society that's still functioning after the disaster, and each of us is a part of that big picture. So thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, for that. I know that there's a lot of details and picture issues you raised here. And so now's a great opportunity for attendees to ask those questions that they might have of you using the chat or the Q&A feature. And I would just, I would say as a quick sort of get people in the thought process for this, everybody has access to the chat. When you send it, it'll come back to Lucy, myself, and Angela. If you could just put a score 1 through 10 on how prepared you feel for the next big earthquake, based on what Lucy described, with 0 being not prepared at all, 10 being you are ready for whatever the earth throws at you. If you put that in the chat, let's see, and I'll share some of that once we get a couple of them coming through here. So just put the numbers 1 through 10, or 0 through 10, 0 being not at all, 10 being extremely ready. I'm seeing a couple folks putting 5s and 6s coming through. It seems to be the theme over and over again. A couple folks are going a little lower, and that's okay. I think that the more information you have, the more you're able to take that next first step. And so as you're thinking about your level of preparedness, if you didn't put a 10, what are the things that you need to help you increase your number from a 2 to a 3, from a 5 to a 6, from a 6 to a 7? What information can we provide here? So I'm seeing questions coming in now. See a lot of 2s and 3s. So Lucy, maybe as we're waiting for people to type out their question, and I'm sure they will be, could you talk for a minute about maybe 1 or 2 of the anecdotes that you've seen from other countries? That I know you've visited Chile after their big earthquake. I know that you've visited New Zealand after their big earthquake. When you talk to small business owners and those who worked with them, what's the reaction? What's the narrative they tell you about the experience they had and what it took to come back?
It depends. Well, it varies a lot. The people that have had really heavy levels of damage, in Japan, I went to the areas where the tsunami had wiped out the community. They handle earthquakes much better than we do. They have stronger building codes, but the tsunami was bigger than anybody had ever imagined was possible, and these communities were completely wiped out. And it was, I met one woman whose house was taken out by the tsunami, and 5 years after the event was just finally going to be moving into permanent housing again. So she spent 5 years living in temporary housing. I remember someone else with the Kobe earthquake, and in the Kobe earthquake, a lot of older people were living in traditional housing, which then fared very badly in the earthquake. So it was really skewed toward the people who lost housing were really skewed towards older people. And they ended up living in containers, like shipping containers, because that was a way they were able to easily mobilize space. And just, I don't want to grow old in a shipping container. And I think that level of sort of thinking of the planning going forward. At the same time, there's incredibly motivating pictures in northern Japan, a very traditional area where women have traditionally had very restricted roles. One of the things that happened has been women going, I have to get out and start a business to support my family. And a network that has formed among women entrepreneurs who were doing businesses they never imagined doing before, and accomplishing it. And then the sort of the ability to come back was really, really strong. I will say that at the same time, someplace like in Sendai, they didn't have the tsunami, they had a magnitude 9, they had such good construction. Basically, the disruption was limited to a few months, and they were able to pull it back. And I think the thing that Japan, well, and in Chile too, was the degree to which the proper mitigation just really made the disaster not there. It's hard to see the disasters that don't happen because you mitigate, but that's what we're talking about here.
And I think you raised a couple of the key points here, and then I have another question that came through, and that point is around that network of individuals. And I know that many of you participating today are either part of networks or are part of associations or other connections you have with other business owners. And the greater the connection you have amongst business owners in proximity or within your industry, the stronger and more resilient you'll be in the face of these large disasters. And so part of the work we do at the center is to make sure that we foster those connections as effectively as possible, because after the mitigation that prevents the disaster, if the disaster happens because the mitigations were not in place, that social network, that connection between individuals and organizations and each other is what really hastens the recovery and allows for a faster recovery. I saw a question come in that says, what should be expected in terms of destruction disaster in LA in the event hit by a major earthquake? So Lucy, maybe speak through what are the direct impacts that we could see in the moments after that, like let's say the shakeout earthquake along the San Andreas Fault. What's the LA basin going to look like? Okay, so yes, we did, when I was at the USGS, I led a project to
model in detail what a San Andreas earthquake would be like. Now, this is not necessarily it's not the worst earthquake for people who are in the Los Angeles basin, because the San Andreas Fault is a bit out of town. But we still expect to see significant pockets of damage in a lot of places. We expect the electricity to be gone, just because a lot of our electricity at this point, we don't generate it within the Los Angeles basin. We now bring it in from across the San Andreas Fault. And when the fault moves, and you remember that picture of the fault offset, that's going to break anything crossing the fault. And that includes gasoline pipelines, the natural gas pipelines, electric lines, and water lines. So probably the biggest impact that we know everybody will share is a disruption to supplies, lifelines, supply chains, transportation. Add in when the electricity goes out, you lose all traffic signals. And you think traffic's bad now in LA. The day after the earthquake, it's going to be a hell of a lot more. The total, we expect about 1,800 dead, many of those in that non-ductile concrete buildings and in places that burn. And I think that's the other really big one that we worry about, is that all big urban earthquakes trigger fires. There's just too many things in a building that can burn. And then we have with disruption to transportation, it's hard for the fire department to get there. We will have fires that get out of control and turn into large conflagrations. We've never seen an urban earthquake that doesn't lead to some amount of that. In Northridge, there were 110 fires that got started that called out the fire department, and they were just barely able to keep them in control because they had mutual aid from other communities. When we have the San Andreas earthquake, many more communities will be having fires and we won't be able to get the mutual aid. So I think all of those disruption sort of things, I said that 1,800 dead, about half of them are estimated to be from the fires, and the other half mostly in these older buildings that have the known problems. But because of the damage to constructions, the other really big one is going to be loss of housing. And the shakeout estimate created back in 2008 was 250,000 households that will lose their housing. Now, the efforts that have been undertaken over the last decade to get retrofit of soft first story probably have made a big difference in that. I think we've at least halved the number of households that will need temporary housing because of that retrofit program. And that's huge. That's really going to change the dynamic and greatly increase the likelihood that we're going to get people to stay here.
Great. And I think that one of the considerations also, since we are a center for science and society, is to let folks know that all that data is around the main shock, the initial earthquake. But in fact, the big one that we're talking about here, the San Andreas earthquake, will likely have a aftershock that's the size of the Northridge earthquake, at least one of that size. It may be days after, it may be weeks after, it may be months after. And that goes back to the idea of what happened in Christchurch, where you had an aftershock that was much closer to the city center and caused even more damage. So the big one is not a one and done experience for us. But as we build resilience, as we prepare our individual businesses, we work with our neighboring businesses and others within our industry, we'll be much better situated to manage what comes in the big one and its aftermath. Is there any protections? And Lucy, you mentioned there's a question about protections. You mentioned that there's some retrofit that could be done. Could you speak to maybe what has been done to protect some buildings in the Los Angeles area?
Okay. The engineers know how to make just about every building resistant to earthquakes, but it's not mandated in a lot of locations. Los Angeles County has actually done better than most of the other counties on this in this regard. Unreinforced masonry, those are brick buildings. Those are by far the deadliest. And every jurisdiction in Los Angeles County has mandated retrofit, so we have none left, which is pretty significant. The In terms of soft first story, there are a dozen Southern California cities that have enacted retrofit. Many of our larger communities, Long Beach has not yet. They are still working on trying to develop an inventory of what their buildings are, but Los Angeles, Pasadena, Santa Monica, Burbank, Beverly Hills,
Culver City.
Culver City, yeah, Culver City just passed it, that's right. I think there's a few others that I'm forgetting at this point, but, and that's a really big one. It is more primarily is aimed at that residential issue. In terms of when you look at, I think it's a bigger issue. I mean, there's one thing when you own a space, but of course in a business you're often renting, and the market responds to what people ask for. And if no one asks the landlord about the earthquake resilience of their building, he has no incentive to try and do something about it. So probably the most important thing you can do is individually go and ask them. You probably can't break your lease because you now discover that they didn't retrofit it. But if the landlord realizes his tenants want it, it's going to change the discussion. It's very, the problem is, of course, they'll say, oh, we're fine, we follow codes, and that isn't enough. You can, ask for a structural engineering evaluation, and, hopefully, one thing is to work with landlords to try and make this better.
Right. So just in short, to find out if you're a tenant in a building, you ask the landlord what the status of the retrofit is, what year construction it was made. If you're not getting the answers you're looking for, depending upon the city you're in, the city may have records as to whether the year built and type of construction. But to get the definitive answer, you do need that evaluation from an engineer.
And in general, the buildings built before 1980 are the more problematic ones.
Correct.
And so a concrete building before 1980 is one where an evaluation is really needed to tell you whether or not you've got a problem.
There's a question about tsunamis and what's the possibility. And I know, Lucy, this is one where we could feel a little bit safer in most of LA County.
Right. It's a funny thing, but LA County is one of for being on the Pacific coast, we're one of the safest communities, and for a couple of reasons. One is that much of California's coast is cliff. Right? A tsunami is a sudden increase in sea level. If you're in Santa Monica, you got to worry about the tsunami if you're down on the beach. But think about it: there's a cliff right there, and once you're up on top of that water on that cliff, you're perfectly fine. And so you have to find there's a very few locations. There are some where you have to be close to sea level. So for instance, like in Playa Vista or Huntington Beach, places that are really flat going down to the water, then you could have a bigger chance. But when we've modeled what tsunamis created around the Pacific Ocean could come in here, we find that we are situated in such a way that very few ever affect the LA area. Our coast is turned around from where many of the tsunamis are coming in from. And sort of the maximum tsunami we see anywhere in LA County is only about 10 feet. And even that's in rare places. And just go check what your elevation is. You're probably above 10 feet. So that's one thing. If you really are a seaside business, one of the big impacts from a tsunami that we still get, even though it doesn't raise it too much, would be high currents. So when we actually, just like we did the shakeout scenario back at the USGS, we created what was called the Safer Tsunami scenario, where we looked at the worst tsunami we could get into the LA area, and then looked at what it did. And there are maps associated with it of like where water could come in. But like by the time you get to Lincoln Boulevard, by the time you get to Highway 1, pretty much you're completely out of the area of risks. So and then when you think of local tsunamis, right, the really big ones happen because of local earthquakes, but you have to the fault has to be underwater pretty much, because to create a tsunami is you have to change the shape of the seafloor. And the most likely way it's happened is that fault, like we saw the picture in New Zealand. Now imagine that that happens underwater. In fact, for that earthquake, part of it was underwater and it created a tsunami. But we don't have the faults we have offshore are mostly sideways moving. They don't move vertically, which is what you need to change the shape of the seafloor. We could trigger a landslide by having a strike slip earthquake offshore. But that changes the shape of the seafloor on a pretty small area, just where you're having the landslide. So you could get a tsunami, but it's local. And even then, the worst one they think they've modeled with a local one, again, a very narrow area, would be only about 50 feet. So again, if you're 50 feet above sea level, you don't have to worry about anything at all.
So less worry about tsunami if you're in LA County, especially if you're any distance from the coast itself. So anybody in the San Fernando Valley or past San Gabriel Valley, there's no threat of tsunami ever impacting you directly.
Get west of the 405 or east of the 405, and it just isn't there.
All right, we've got just a few moments left. If there's another question, we're happy to take that last question so that we can provide that insight in helping your business prepare. I saw some great comments, and thanks so much for those in the chat. With that, why don't I turn it back to Angela to close us out.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you to Dr. Lucy Jones for that incredible presentation. And thank you for the Dr. Jones Center for Science and Society for your partnership and for being such an important leader in the community. It's very important for small businesses and individuals to be prepared. So thank you for your expertise. With that said, to wrap things up, I want to take your attention one more time to the link that I dropped into the chat. If anyone is interested and in need of further assistance and resources, we have a short business intake form that we would like you to complete. And as soon as a business completes that, we receive it directly in our inbox. So once we are able to receive some more information about your areas of need, we will connect you with a live regional manager that serves your area. Like I also mentioned, we present webinars twice a month, and these are always around a small business educational informative resource with some sort of takeaway like we did this morning. So please save the date for October 26th. That is from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. And during that webinar, we will be covering the City of Los Angeles's new Comeback Checks program grants. So we'll be covering 2 grants that are up and coming. One is the Restaurant and Small Business Recovery Program. So specifically for generally small businesses as well as restaurants. And the second one that we'll be covering is the Small Business Rental Assistance Program. Once again, that's October 26th, 11 a.m. And if you are interested in registering for that, please visit laedc.org/coronavirus. And there's a webinar button where you will see the remaining of the October schedule as well as November and beyond. So with that said, once again, thank you to everyone for your time and for joining us this morning. And on behalf of Together for LA, we hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. And thank you once again to our partners, the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, and we hope you have a wonderful day.